Hello everyone, this is a short revision clip on subsidies as a traditional method used by governments as a form of government intervention to correct market failure. This is used for the AQA A-level economics course. So by definition, a subsidy is any form of government support, both financial or otherwise, offered to producers and occasionally consumers. So if we look at the nature of goods that we wish to subsidize, they tend to be merit goods, goods which are often underproduced and underconsumed by society. However, they are goods that present positive externalities of consumption whenever consumers do actively consume those goods. Now, when we look at reasons as to why they would be underproduced in the first instance, it's often that maybe there would be a profit or there's a lack of a profit incentive to produce those goods. So governments will subsidize firms to encourage them, to incentivize them to produce goods and services of which they wish to see more being consumed within society. We often see examples of where the government will give subsidies directly to the consumer in order to allow them to financially be able to purchase a good which the government feels that they should be consuming, things like free school meals, for example. If we look here at some examples before we start, biofuel subsidies for farmers. So agriculture, certainly within the UK, is one of the most heavily subsidized industries in the country. If you think of things like the farmers cannot control the weather. Governments may subsidize them in order to keep them in business during years whenever financially they may not have performed very well. Solar panel feeds, if you think of, for example, the government will want to encourage people to use more renewable sources of energy. And so what can we do to encourage people to switch to more renewable forms of energy? We can pay for them to have solar panels fitted on their houses in order for them to benefit and generate their own electricity. Apprenticeship schemes. So we see examples of subsidies happening within labour markets. The governments will subsidise employers and they'll basically say, look, we understand the increase in costs that firms will incur when they employ members of staff, and we understand that as profit maximisers, you may be rather cautious of employing members of staff due to the rising levels of costs. So what we will do in order to get young people into work, in order for people to be trained to do certain jobs, we will give you money that will allow you to offer training schemes to train up people that you want to work for you, and we can subsidize their wages within the first couple of months. That takes the burden away from the employer, so it actually allows them to increase employment. Governments like that because, remember, employment is one of the key macroeconomic objectives, and individuals get a job. They get to be trained in industries that they wish to show an interest in. Aids to businesses making losses. I think COVID-19 is the perfect example. The furlough scheme, for example, business crisis loans, or even subsidies to businesses to say, look, we understand that due to circumstances beyond your control, like COVID-19, we still want your business to operate, but we will give you money to keep your business afloat until we get to better times, until the economy starts to recuperate again, and you can start making money in the way that you once would have done so before. Subsidies for wind farm investment, again, another example of encouraging more renewable sources of energy. The government wish to encourage firms or encourage individuals to use more renewable sources of energy. They want to encourage firms to have access to more renewable forms of energy. We've seen a huge increase in the number of wind farms. A large amount of that has been subsidized by the government as a long-term solution to reducing the need to use fossil fuels as a method of gaining energy. Food and fuel subsidies for consumers. So again, we look at the example of free school meals for children. For families which may not be able to fully fund meals during the school day, governments can give them food subsidies to allow their children to be able to have access to a meal during the school day. Childcare for working families. We see examples of children having access, parents having access to childcare services, which can be very expensive. But we want to subsidize childcare to encourage parents to go back to work and to contribute towards the economy, to contribute towards productivity, to contribute towards GDP. However, we also realize that their children need to be looked after. And rather than individuals taking time out to look after their children, we can send them to professional childminders, professional childcare services, and governments may wish to subsidise those. You will find that particularly mature students that go to university, if they do have children, you sometimes tend to find there's a creche on the university campus for students, be it young students or mature students who do have children but do wish to continue with their studies. Subsidies to the rail industry. So again, many young people have subsidised travel on their Oyster cards, for example, to get to and from school. Again, it would be too much of an expense to expect a child to pay for that, but also too much of a burden on their parents. It also reduces that excuse of not getting youngsters to school, that by law children have to go to school, and the cost of travel may be one of the reasons which may prevent a child from going to school. So all examples there of where subsidies could potentially be paid to individuals or indeed to firms as well. So what effect then, what impact does a producer subsidy have on the market price and output? How does it affect the free market? So state subsidies are financed from general taxation or by borrowing. So if subsidies are forms of financial aid from the government, always ask yourself the question of, well, if the government are handing out money, how did they get that money handed to them in the first instance? So governments will collect money through taxation or revenue from taxation, and with that, that presents the government then with a pot of money. They've got a pot of money then that they can use to spend. We say it should be used in terms of fiscal policy to achieve the macroeconomic objectives, but government can use that taxation to subsidize firms and to subsidize individuals in order for them to achieve certain outcomes in society. The subsidy causes a shift in the firm's supply curve, and that supply curve will shift to the right, which, if you remember your supply and demand diagrams, a shift to the right of the supply curve is an increase in the supply of a good or service. The amount spent on the subsidy will equal to the subsidy per unit multiplied by the total output. So again, just like with taxation, we look at the tax per unit, we multiply it by the quantity sold, and with a subsidy, we look at how much of that good is sold and what is the subsidy per unit in terms of how much expenditure does the government actively spend on this subsidy. A direct subsidy to the consumer has the effect of boosting demand, i.e. an outward shift in demand. Now, this is where it gets slightly confused because sometimes students will draw two shifts on the one curve. In the first instance, if you're drawing just a subsidy diagram to show the impact of a subsidy, it is a shift outwards of the supply curve. The long run impact of that is that will create a boost in demand because it's now cheaper to purchase that good. And again, we'll look at that now on the diagram. So I'm going to switch over now to the visualizer to give you a visual representation of what that diagram for a subsidy actually looks like. And again, diagrams in economics, a diagram can speak 1,000 words. So make sure you listen carefully to how this diagram operates. So on the y-axis, we've got our price. We've got 0 in the corner, and then we've got quantity then on the x-axis. Do your normal supply and demand diagram. So we've got downward sloping demand and upward sloping supply. Then do your original equilibrium, price and quantity. Now remember, this is the price that is set by the free market. A market is free if it is free from government intervention, i.e. there is no presence of government intervention in this market. So we've got P1 and Q1 here, okay? So again, we'll use the example, we'll say, for example, this is £6. So the good is priced at £6. The issue now with this is that the government believe that, first of all, this good is under-consumed at Q1. It's underproduced and under-consumed. And the reason for that is that the good maybe is too expensive. So the reason why consumers are only purchasing Q1 and not anything greater than Q1 is potentially because the good is too expensive. So things like gym membership. Now, if we go to the gym, it keeps us fit and healthy. It keeps us in a good mindset, both mentally and physically. It means that we could potentially be more productive at work. We'd be less inclined to illnesses that would stop us from working later on and stop us from contributing towards productivity and stop us from contributing towards GDP, for example. So this good, in effect, is too expensive. and it's been underproduced and underconsumed in the economy. So governments realize this is a problem. Not enough people are going to the gym. Not enough people are using healthy or eating healthy food. Not enough people are, for example, going into more renewable sources of energy, for example. So what does this do? A supply, the government's introduced a subsidy, which subsequently then by default will shift the supply curve outwards to the right, okay, from S to S1. I'm going to call it S2 rather. And then in brackets, I'm going to write beside a subsidy to indicate that the reason for the outward shift is because of a subsidy, a government grant. So another word for a subsidy is a grant. So original equilibrium, I'm going to title that as A, and the new equilibrium, I'm going to title that as B. And again, I'm going to do a dashed line to indicate my new quantity of Q2 and my new price, or my new equilibrium price of P2. Now we'll say this has brought it down now to £4. So the subsidy has made the good now cheaper for the consumer to purchase. And we get that extension along the supply curve from point A down to point B. Why is there that extension? Because the good now is cheaper. So therefore, law of demand, as the price of the good falls, the quantity demanded of the good will increase. And we see that here. Price has fallen from £6 to £4. Therefore, quantity has increased from Q1 up to Q2. So more people now are consuming this good because the price of the good now is more accessible to certain families, particularly those maybe on lower incomes. Those that wouldn't have bought the good before at £6 because they felt that was too expensive, they can now purchase that good at £4. To complete that diagram, what we need to do is, first of all, I'm just going to mention one thing here. Remember Q2, you might remember from the previous video on a taxation, we look at the socially optimum level of output. Governments have been successful in increasing consumption of the good. They've increased consumption up to the socially optimum level of output, a socially optimum level of output. So once originally was Q1, we've increased it now up to Q2. More firms are producing it because the subsidy has created a profit incentive for the firm. Don't forget that. The subsidy has created a profit incentive for the firm to produce the good, and the consumer now has more access to that good because the price of the good now is subsequently cheaper. To work out now your subsidy per unit, go to point B, which is our new equilibrium, and get your ruler then and go straight up until you hit the original supply curve. And I'm going to do it in orange, and we get this area here of welfare, not loss, but welfare gain. This is the amount of welfare that has been gained as a result of this subsidy. So let's go do an arrow in here of a welfare gain, okay? At the top of that welfare gain, up here, point C, if we move across, an interesting one here, this shows us what the producer gets. So I'm going to call that P3. So the producer gets P3, and they get a lifter of money, so to speak, in layman's terms, in order to produce more of the good, but to sell it to consumers at a cheaper price. So P1 is the original price. P3 is a payment to the producer, and P2 is the new price that the good will be sold at. Okay, so P3 only applies to the producer, and P1 and P2 apply to both producer and consumer, but notably to the consumer. So consumers originally paid £6, they now only pay £4. If we say that P3, let's say, is £8, that's an incentive, an additional £2 to produce that good for the firm, an additional profit incentive to produce £2. The difference between 8 and 4, this between C and B is our subsidy per unit. And if I take £8 minus the £4, it gives me £4 subsidy per unit, okay, with a welfare gain. That welfare gain illustrates that there's now an increase in the consumers. More people now have access to this good because it's now cheaper for firms to supply that good, okay? So hopefully that again gives you diagrams in economics. A diagram speaks 1,000 words. So know your diagrams. Again, the beauty of these videos is that you can stop and start them and draw them along with me so that you become more comfortable with it. If I jump back now to my PowerPoint and I look now at different, again, if I look at justifying why would the governments want to pay or different types of producer subsidies, and why would they want to do that? You've got looking at a guaranteed payment on the factor cost of the product. For example, a minimum price offered to farmers, such as under the old style common agricultural policy. So governments would basically subsidize farmers to say, look, no matter how much of a good you produce, you will get, this is the minimum price that we will make sure that you always get paid for that. So regardless of the workings of the free market, we'll always make sure that you don't, in effect, get screwed over because of the constant changes to the free market. An input subsidy, which subsidizes the cost of inputs used in production. For example, employment subsidy for taking on more workers. So if you want to increase employment, one of the best ways of increasing employment is to pay firms to employ more members of staff. And hopefully with the intention that if you subsidize them within the first few months, that the firm sees the financial impact that can bring with it through employing more workers, and subsequently you can then experience an increase in productivity later on. Government grants to cover losses made by businesses. Again, we see that in the rail industry, loss-making airlines. We know that these are pivotal industries to the UK. We need them. They're almost essential for some people. And if there isn't a profit incentive, firms will leave those industries. So the government will subsidize in order to keep them in that industry. Again, we see COVID-19, another perfect example of the furlough scheme. We basically subsidize firms to keep employing staff, even if they're not working, to stop them from making people unemployed, because it doesn't make financial sense business-wise to keep employing people when there's no money coming through the door. Bailouts, for example, for financial organizations in the wake of a credit crunch. So think about now, it's very difficult to do this if the economy is in a recession, because remember, there will not be massive amounts of funds available. However, governments will have to be creative in the way that they do bring about those sustained increase in subsidies. Financial assistance, for example, loans and grants for businesses setting up in areas of high unemployment, for example, as part of a regional policy designed to boost the levels of employment. So governments might actually subsidize certain areas within the UK. And you do see that particularly within boroughs within London, governments will subsidize more boroughs than some others to make them more affluent, to bring a bit of wealth, to bring an element of economic prosperity to certain areas of the country. Some justifications. So why would governments want to do this? It is, again, it's a form of government intervention. They're introduced for a number of economic, social, and political reasons. So governments can manipulate taxation to, in effect, win over consumers or win over society. So you think about poor families helping with food and childcare costs. We think about Labour government at one time suggested giving free school meals to every child in the country. Now, you could argue that that was to make sure that children have an access to meals during the school day, but you could also argue that was almost a political stunt as well, to be seen more favourably in the eyes of the voters. But we realise that children are growing up in poverty in the UK, and governments need to step in. They need to look after those families that are not always able to look after themselves. Encourage output and investment in fledgling sectors. So look at where are the industries that you want to see growth in. So we've seen significant investment into IT, into construction, into engineering, into the finance sector, into property, for example, into agriculture, into STEM subjects, science, technology, engineering, and mathematics. Governments see industries where they could help the economy in great ways. And so we want to subsidize entry into those industries because we know the economic benefits that can come with them. Protecting jobs in loss-making industries, for example, those industries that have been hit by a recession. So we will subsidize in order to keep people in jobs, to stop them from losing their jobs. Make some healthcare treatments more affordable. So again, those on low incomes, they can maybe benefit from subsidized medical treatments. Governments can also subsidize research and development into new medicines and treatments to make sure that people are getting the most effective form of treatment. Reduce the cost of training and employing workers. So again, look at the additional costs that stem from the employment of individuals, and what can governments do to try and make it more profitable for firms to employ staff. Achieve a more equitable income distribution. So we look at situations where, if you look at subsidies and how they're funded through taxation. Well, who pays the most tax? It's normally those on high incomes that pay the most tax, or they contribute more in real terms to tax revenue for governments. So as a result, a subsidy is almost a form of social justice, where we're taking money from those that have it to redistribute out to those who are less fortunate. So if people can afford certain goods, let them pay for it themselves. But where those families that cannot, and those individuals that cannot afford those goods, we can subsidize them in order to have access to those goods, so that they don't lose out on some of the lifestyle choices that some other individuals have. Reduce some of the external costs of transport. So if we subsidize, if we look, for example, school children, if we subsidize their public transport, it means that we don't have every parent driving their child to school every day, causing even greater congestion, leading to even greater pollution caused by more people driving. If we get people onto the trains and the tubes and the buses, and we've got more people on one service, and therefore it contributes less to pollution and congestion than in some other cases. Theatre, if we look at encouraging arts and other cultural services, again, the impact of COVID-19 has seen a huge hit to the arts sector, and we will probably see over the next number of months and years governments seeking to do whatever they can to invest into that industry, because it is very much so a profitable one before COVID-19. Some arguments then against subsidies. So what's the issue with them? What must we look at them with a degree of caution? The economic and social case for a subsidy should be judged carefully on the grounds of efficiency and on fairness. Is it the most equitable source of intervention? Might the money used up in the subsidy payment be better spent elsewhere? There is that age-old opportunity cost. If you subsidize free school meals, it means you have to forego being able to fund something else. There's an opportunity cost with every subsidy. If you put a subsidy in one area, it means you can't put money then in another. And are you putting it in the area that is most in need? Are you putting it in the area that you're going to get the greatest return from? Government subsidies inevitably carry an opportunity cost, and in the long run, there might be better ways of providing financial support to producers and workers in specific industries. What governments must be very careful on is creating a culture of reliance on the government. And again, if you're a free market economist, you believe that if the market no longer demands the good, then you don't supply it, even if it's good for you or not. You're motivated by the profit incentive. And the argument here is that governments could be argued to be seen to be funding unprofitable organizations, and that needs to be looked at with a degree of caution, because by funding an unprofitable organization, a profitable one becomes even less profitable as a result of not having access to government support. Free market economists argue that subsidies distort the working of the free market mechanism and can carry or can lead to government failure when intervention leads to a worsening of the distribution of resources. So we have seen examples of where governments have subsidized and it's been abused. So within the agricultural industries, some farmers have been caught abusing subsidies. Some public sectors even have been caught not spending subsidies in the most effective and efficient way. Normally, when a subsidy is imposed on an individual, if they receive a subsidy, there are certain conditions that come with it. Here's money, but here's how it should be spent. Some other points is that, again, I said before, it distorts the market. Subsidies distort the market price. It does away with the movement of the free market. Arbitrary assistance. Decisions about who receives a subsidy can be arbitrary based upon political aims. One political party may think that one political group deserves more or less of assistance than another. Financial cost. Subsidies can become expensive in the long run. Note the opportunity cost. So there's both an opportunity cost, but also a financial cost. If you think of, again, Labour government had a notion of subsidising everybody's tuition fees to go to university. Think about the sheer cost year on year of subsidising tuition fees. Somebody would have to pay for that. And again, the rate of tax would probably be something significant in order to pay for that. Who pays and who benefits? The final cost of a subsidy usually falls on consumers or taxpayers who themselves may not have derived any benefit from that subsidy. So I pay my tax every month from working over the past 7 years. However, I have not received any subsidy for the government. So some individuals do pay heavy levels of tax, but they don't receive any assistance, probably because financially they don't need to. There are other people in the economy who do deserve and who do need those rates of subsidies. Encouraging inefficiencies. So subsidy can artificially protect inefficient firms who need to restructure, i.e. it delays much needed reforms. So again, it depends on what side of the fence you sit on. Are you for or against subsidizing loss-making industries? Do you think it makes sense to continue to plow money into an industry which you're just basically keeping afloat? It's not doing enough to bring in money. It's not doing enough to remain financially stable. There's the risk of fraud, ever-present risk of fraud when allocating subsidy payments. The system of the, again, the common agreement program with the agriculture industry, farm subsidies have been heavily criticised for the level of fraud that has been involved with it. Governments were funding them, but they were not being used in the way to bring about the most effective outcomes. There are alternatives out there as well. It may be possible to achieve the objectives of subsidies by alternative means which have less distorting effects. So subsidies, the main issue with them is that they're very expensive, and if they are going to be used, they need to be used in a way that the government are confident that they will use or they will reap the greatest return from them. Subsidies used in isolation are less effective than if part of strategic integrated solution to a particular economic social problem. So what we're saying here is that a subsidy on its own, being the absolute only strategy, is not the best strategy, but using a combination, an integrated approach of strategies. So for example, use and implement taxation, and with the indirect tax, use the revenue from taxation to therefore fund subsidies. And therefore you're making money, you're making money in order to spend money in areas of the economy later. Some evaluation points then finally on subsidies. A subsidy might be justified if it encourages increased supply and consumption of products that yield high external benefits. These are goods that produce high positive externalities of consumption. This can help to overcome a market failure problem. Why might the government be justified in providing financial assistance to producers in certain markets and industries? How valid are those arguments? You could argue to keep prices down and to control inflation. Remember on that diagram, the price will be lower than under the free market. So if there's evidence of inflation, then we could use subsidies. The danger is there that even though you're lowering the price, it is increasing demand for the good. So therefore, aggregate demand could potentially increase. However, that's quite extreme because that's only a subsidy in one market. The government doesn't subsidize every other market out there. In the last couple of years, several countries have been offering fuel subsidies to consumers and businesses in the wake of the steep increase in the world crude oil prices. So they still want people to consume or purchase fuel, but they realize it's too expensive, so they have to actually try and control that increase in oil prices, oil being used as a good in fuel. To encourage consumption of merit goods and services which are said to generate positive externalities, increased social benefits. Examples might include subsidies for investment in environmental goods and services like your wind farms and your renewable sources of energy, your solar panels. Reduce the cost of capital investment projects, which might help to stimulate economic growth by increasing long-run aggregate supply. So governments can increase capital projects for infrastructure, for example. Schools are heavily subsidized. They might subsidize them to go into a certain area of the curriculum to build more onto the school in order to cope with the increased number of children coming up through the years. Subsidies to slow down the process of long-term decline in an industry, for example, fishing or mining. So we set subsidies to encourage fishermen to continue to fish, and in mining industries as well, where we've seen a huge decline in the demand for those goods. There is still a demand for them, but less a demand than what there would have been before, but we still want them to operate, and we want to try and slow down that rate of decline. And subsidies then to boost demand for industries during a recession. For example, the car scrappage scheme. So if you remember the car scrappage scheme, governments were saying to people, look, change your car if it's after a certain year, and we'll give you a flat rate. I think it was around 2,000. So if you trade in your old car to buy a brand new one, which is much more environmentally friendly, regardless of the state of the old car, will give you £2,000. And of course, £2,000 was much greater than any value you would have got for it on the open market if you were to sell it on for somebody else to use it. Some final points, again, always ask yourself the question, are the subsidies effective in meeting their aims? Will they achieve the desired stimulus to demand and consumption? Is the subsidy powerful enough in bringing about the desired change? Is the subsidy sufficient? Is it at the right rate? Remember, ask yourself the question, is the rate of the subsidy per unit, is it high enough to create a strong enough incentive for people to want to purchase or consume the good? Will a subsidy affect productivity or efficiency? Subsidies for investment and research can bring positive spillovers, but firms may become dependent on state aid financial assistance, and that's the danger of the nanny state, where the government is always looking after the firm. The firm becomes too reliant. Sometimes the best firms operate on the free market. How much does the subsidy cost and who benefits? Is the subsidy part self-financing? Will it create more tax revenue? Is it a situation where are you getting enough in from that revenue? Will the subsidy, again, are you spending money to make money? Are you getting an outcome from spending money in this area? Or does the subsidy create an expensive extra burden for taxpayers? Are we basically going to have to increase tax to finance the subsidy, but to finance a subsidy that's not reaping the best reward? Does the subsidy help to correct market failure? For example, do more people find work with childcare subsidies? So what does the research show? If childcare subsidies are offered, are people working the hours, and are they working in the jobs that we want them to be doing? Or does the subsidy lead to undesired, unintended consequences? Is there fraud? Is there distortion of the market? Do individuals abuse the subsidy? Is the subsidy just simply not effective in bringing about that increase in consumption? So again, hopefully that was another useful video, just giving you an overview on what a subsidy is, how a subsidy works, the diagram for a subsidy, the fact that it increases supply, it creates that profit incentive. We've also then looked at challenging the effectiveness of that subsidy in terms of evaluation. And like I said, for the 25-mark essay questions, evaluation is that key to getting those top marks, being able to challenge the true effectiveness of that policy. So thank you for watching, and hopefully you find that useful.